My job always requires caution and professionalism, but no one can be prepared for the unexpected. When a colleague confessed his feelings to me, I thought it was just a harmless drunken confession, but things turned out to be far more complicated. Before I could handle the situation, I was faced with extreme reactions from my husband, which made me question, did I really do the right thing by refusing to sacrifice my career for a relationship that is now falling apart? My research job has always required a high level of focus and precision. I had spent nearly 2 years working with my main colleague on an important project, a project that was not only highly technical, but also a significant opportunity to establish our careers in this field. We had shared a lot over this time, not just about work, but also about personal struggles and concerns. Our professional friendship and support for each other had been the bond that kept us going throughout the project. However, what I didn't expect was that his feelings for me had grown beyond professional boundaries. One evening, after a few drinks, he sent me a long email confessing that he had been in love with me for quite some time. He admitted that his feelings had developed from the moment we started working together. My initial reaction to reading those words was one of shock and confusion. While I had noticed some signs before, I never imagined that this was what he was feeling. He had always been thoughtful, considerate, and professional, so I hadn't considered that there was anything unusual in his actions. After reading the email, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I didn't know how to respond. His feelings were completely unexpected, and they weren't something I had ever encouraged. My heart belonged entirely to my husband, and the bond we had as colleagues was all I could offer him. I had no romantic feelings for him, and I wanted everything to return to normal, with no complications in our working relationship. Immediately, I began drafting a response, trying to organize my thoughts and figure out how to handle the situation delicately but firmly. I wanted to make it clear that I valued our professional relationship and friendship, but also to assert that I had no romantic feelings for him whatsoever. However, I was concerned that this might affect our work together. We were in the middle of a long-term project, and I didn't want this to disrupt everything. The next day, I felt it was necessary to share this with my husband. I told him about the email and explained that I didn't know how to handle the situation. My husband had always been my sounding board, and I hoped he could help me find a reasonable way forward. But when I showed him the drafts I had written to organize my thoughts, his reaction was not what I had expected. He didn't seem to offer any understanding. Instead, he became upset and even made a suggestion that I couldn't believe I should quit my job immediately, or our relationship would face serious problems. I was taken aback by this response. Everything was happening so fast and unexpectedly that I couldn't help but laugh in disbelief. I couldn't imagine abandoning a job I had worked so hard for, especially because of something like this. Was my husband being serious, or was he just angry and unsure of how to handle the situation? The tension escalated when he repeatedly insisted that I had to choose between him and my career, which was something I simply could not accept. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about my conversation with my husband. His reaction left me feeling confused and pressured, and I realized that this was not an issue that could be resolved quickly. I had always been able to share everything with him, but this time, it seemed like we couldn't find common ground. I understood that he was worried, but asking me to quit my job was something I couldn't accept. Our relationship was important, but I also couldn't sacrifice such a big part of my career over a situation that was beyond my control. My husband began acting in a way that made me feel increasingly cornered. He was no longer the man I could talk to openly and honestly. Instead, he became angry and even frustrated when I tried to explain that I wouldn't quit my job and that I had no feelings for my colleague. I couldn't understand why he was reacting this way. It felt like he was trying to force me into a corner, making me choose between him and my career, between family and work. That didn't feel fair, and I couldn't accept being coerced like that. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he would either avoid the conversation or become even more agitated. There were moments when he would remain silent, staring at me with an expression of disappointment, making me feel like I had done something wrong. I couldn't explain any more clearly that my colleague's feelings didn't change anything in our relationship. I loved him, but my career was also incredibly important to me. A few days later, I started sensing the tension in the air. He no longer treated me the same way. Every morning, as I prepared to leave for work, I could see the worried look in his eyes, as if he feared I might leave him. Every time I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling of carrying a heavy burden. He hadn't said it outright, but I knew he was afraid of something that I couldn't fully grasp. That feeling made me uneasy and distracted at work. We slowly fell into a cycle of tension, and I started feeling exhausted. I didn't want to choose between work and family, between my career dreams and the love in my marriage. It made me start questioning whether I had been wrong not to notice that our relationship had begun to change in a troubling way. I just wanted everything to return to how it was before, where I didn't have to think so much about my career or the strange emotions at work. But it seemed like that was no longer possible. A week later, the situation became even more tense. I had lost count of how many times I tried to explain to my husband that I couldn't quit my job, that my relationship with my colleague wasn't something serious. But he wouldn't listen. The evenings we used to spend together having dinner no longer felt warm. He was either silent or responding with short answers, always avoiding my gaze. Every time I mentioned work, he seemed upset, as though I was challenging him. My husband became colder, and there were moments when I felt like a stranger in my own home. This attitude made me feel guilty, but at the same time I wondered if he understood that I was also suffering from this conflict. I didn't want any tension between us, and all I wanted was a reasonable explanation for this situation. But the more I tried to talk, the more silent and frustrated he became. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed something felt different. He didn't say a word as I left, but I could clearly feel him watching me. When I returned after a long day at work, I never expected things to unfold the way they did. The door to our house had been locked and my luggage was piled up on the porch, as if he had decided that I needed to leave. I stood there, unable to believe my eyes. Everything I was seeing felt like a shock. There were no explanations, no texts, no calls, just my luggage. Sitting there, like a final decision about everything. At that moment, I couldn't think straight. I just stood there, feeling helpless. It wasn't that I wanted to leave, but I couldn't understand why things had escalated to this point. I called him, but got no response. Even though I knew I wasn't in the wrong in this situation, I still felt a sense of unease take over me. What could he do next? That thought lingered in my mind throughout the day. I couldn't continue living in this tension, and I couldn't accept the way he was treating me. After hours of thinking, I decided I had to take action. I couldn't let this tension continue to affect my life. All day, my mind raced with thoughts about what I should do next. Should I try talking to him one more time? Or do I need to take a stronger step to ensure he couldn't continue controlling my life like this? The feeling of confusion and being lost haunted me throughout the night. I knew I couldn't continue living in this tension, and the only thing I could do was seek support from those closest to me. Although I didn't want to make things more complicated, I couldn't face everything alone at this point. I called my sister, someone I deeply trust, and told her everything. At first, I tried to stay calm, but when she heard about what had happened, she wasn't surprised, knowing my husband's personality well. She advised me to leave temporarily to clear my mind and create some space between me and my husband to avoid further tension. Though it wasn't easy, I decided to follow her advice. I went to stay with her and my cousin, both of whom were very supportive of me in this situation. They helped me gather my essential belongings and get ready to leave immediately. At that moment, I still couldn't believe everything had escalated this far. It felt like I was living in a nightmare where everything had been turned upside down. The next morning, I decided to call a locksmith to regain access to the house because I needed to retrieve some important things. Contrary to what I expected, my husband didn't react calmly or reasonably. He showed up at the house in an angry state, and when I asked him to let me get my belongings, he flatly refused. Not only that, he became increasingly confrontational, trying to prevent me from entering. I was shocked by his behavior, but I knew I couldn't let him continue controlling me like this. Things got even more intense when he tried to stop my cousin from helping me collect my things. The exchange between us became more heated, and the situation grew more tense. The sense of being trapped made me unsure of what to do. I couldn't let my life be completely dictated by my husband's anxiety and control. As things escalated, I decided to call the police to handle the situation. By the time the police arrived, it was too late to settle things peacefully. The police asked both my husband and my cousin to leave, and the situation worsened. I changed the locks immediately to ensure that my space would no longer be invaded. While I was somewhat overwhelmed by what had just happened, I also felt a sense of relief knowing I had protected my boundaries. However, I also knew that I would have to make some difficult decisions in the coming days. After this incident, I realized I needed time to think about everything that had happened. I couldn't continue living in this stress and uncertainty, and I needed to figure out my next steps. Both my husband and I needed time to understand what was going on in our relationship, but I knew I could no longer live in an environment of control and disrespect. After the tense incident that day, I felt like I had reached an important crossroads in my life. I couldn't continue living in such exhaustion and stress. My husband had overstepped, and I couldn't keep allowing him to control my life this way. While I didn't want to fracture our relationship, I also understood that if I didn't set boundaries and protect myself, I wouldn't be able to move forward. That evening, after things had calmed down, I sat down with my sister and cousin to discuss what had happened and the next steps. Both were very concerned for me and advised me to think carefully before making any decisions. However, I knew I couldn't return to a life without respect and open communication. Both love and career were important to me, and I couldn't let these incidents tear apart everything I had worked for. The next morning, I decided to send my husband a message, asking him to meet so we could have a serious conversation. I couldn't keep living in this tension and uncertainty. I needed a real conversation, where we could put everything on the table and find a way to resolve things. I wanted him to understand that my refusal to quit my job wasn't a betrayal, but a choice to protect my future and career. However, I also needed him to understand that I loved him, and our relationship was very important. When he responded to my message, he asked me to meet him at a cafe to talk. I knew we needed a private space to have a calm conversation. I arrived, and we began talking. He was still very angry and disappointed, but I tried to remain patient and listen to his thoughts. He said he felt hurt and didn't know what to do, since I wasn't reacting the way he had hoped. He felt abandoned and feared that I wouldn't prioritize him in my life anymore. I listened to what he said, and I shared my feelings as well. I explained that I couldn't quit my job because it was important for my career, and I didn't want our relationship to suffer because of decisions I couldn't change. We argued for a while, but I sensed a slight shift in him when I said that I still wanted us to work together to find a solution, not to turn it into a battle. This conversation didn't lead to an immediate solution, but at least I felt that we had begun to understand each other better. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I felt more determined than ever that I wouldn't let myself be trapped in a situation that didn't respect who I was and what I valued. The decisions ahead would be crucial, and I needed to stay strong to protect what was important to me.